So with heavy rumors of the N64 finally coming to the Nintendo Switch's online service, I thought to myself, hey, we just made a video talking about the Game Boy and Game Boy Color games I want to see, why not do one for the N64 as well? Now there are two types of games that will not be on this list going into it, so just keep that in mind. First off, if a game is already available on the Switch in any way, shape, or form, I'm not going to include it, so a game like Turok or Super Mario 64 does not make the cut. Second, if there are heavy licensing issues with the game, I'm not going to include that either, so a game like GoldenEye 007 or WWF No Mercy won't make the list, but I did manage to get one good wrestling game on the list. So what are the games I want to see on the N64, and why should these games be on there? That's what we're going to talk about in this video, so if this is your first time on the channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button, be sure to like and share the video, but without any further ado, let's get into the list. The first game we're going to talk about is one of the earliest games released on the N64. It's an arcade racer, but I still think it's a lot of fun, and that is Cruisin USA. Now, there were subsequent entries in the Cruisin franchise that were released on the N64, but I feel like this game is a good fit for the Switch Online service just because of the fact that it sort of reminds people of when they first got their N64 and one of the first games they played on it. Now, of course, this is an over-the-top arcade racing game. There is like cows you have to avoid, and you're on all sorts of different tracks going at high speeds. If you've played an arcade racing game before, you sort of know what to expect with this. But hey, there's like hot chicks at the end of the race if you do well too, so I mean, you know, that's kind of a bonus. I really enjoyed Cruisin USA. It's not the best version of the game or anything like that, but I think the N64 version of the game is good enough, and it would be a welcome addition to the Switch Online service. Next up, one of the best kart racing games that technically isn't a kart racer, I guess, would have to be Diddy Kong Racing. Now, Diddy Kong Racing was special because whereas a game like Mario Kart 64, just you had these karts that you rode on in the game, this game offered karts, it offered boats, and it also involved airplanes, which was pretty different than what we saw from all other kart racers available on the N64 at that time. Now, Diddy Kong Racing is a fantastic game, not just because there's a lot of gameplay variety, but the whole adventure mode really makes this game sort of stick out from other kart racers on the system as well, as there's like boss races and cool stuff to explore in this huge open world area that you use to traverse to other areas of the game. I really like the gameplay in this game. I think the graphics still hold up till today, and of course it had a really good battle mode in the game as well. And if we're going to assume that the N64 will follow what the NES and the Super NES do with the Nintendo Switch Online service, I'm going to expect some online multiplayer in these games, and that would be a big addition for Diddy Kong Racing. As much as I would love to have GoldenEye 007 on this list because I like it better than Perfect Dark, I can't do it because there's going to be so many licensing issues with that game that it's just not realistic. So Perfect Dark is definitely the best choice to make when it comes to first-person shooters on the N64. And yes, most people do like Perfect Dark more so than GoldenEye 007. I don't know, just as a kid, I was more into GoldenEye. But Perfect Dark allows you to do things that you couldn't necessarily do in GoldenEye because whereas GoldenEye had a story that was already based on the movie, Perfect Dark and Joanna Dark, you could definitely do a lot more with the story, and I think it made for more interesting set pieces and more interesting levels. Of course, it is a first-person shooter. There's lots of cool gadgets you get in the game as well, and it's essentially the spiritual successor to GoldenEye 007, so it's good enough for me. Sprinkle in some online multiplayer if they decide to put this game on the service, and this would be one of the most popular games on the Nintendo Switch Online service, and rightfully so because it's a really good game. Now, I know I said that Diddy Kong Racing was definitely different than Mario Kart 64, but I said that just so I could add Mario Kart 64 to this list, because, I mean, come on, it's freaking Mario Kart 64. Look, I get it. People have nostalgia for the Mario Kart on the Super Nintendo, and, like, I played that game as a kid. I played it over at my cousin's house, and I definitely had fun with it, but I didn't own a Super Nintendo, so I didn't get really emotionally invested in this game. When Mario Kart 64 came out, this game absolutely blew my mind, and it's still a fantastic game to play today. Of course, you have your different racers you go on these different tracks and whatnot. Toad's Turnpike is still like the best track in any Mario Kart game. I don't care what anyone says. The music is so good. It's just so much fun to play this game. And then once again, you also have a battle mode with this game, which would really lead to some fun stuff with online. You can't have the N64 online without having Mario Kart 64, so it's on the list, damn it. When it comes to The Legend of Zelda, of course, there are 2 games to choose from on the N64, and while a bunch of people love Majora's Mask, I never really got super into it. Like, I finally finished it on the 3DS with the 3DS version of the game, and I definitely liked it. I like the darker tone, but for me, Ocarina of Time is just one of the best Zelda games of all time, and for me, that's the game I want to see on the Nintendo Switch's online service. It's a timeless game. Like, there's so much stuff to do in that game. There's so many secrets, there's so many side quests. You, of course, have all these awesome dungeons, all these awesome boss battles, a really good story, which up until that time, you know, Link to the Past definitely had a great story, but I feel like this story was more realized with Ocarina of Time just because of the 3D graphics. Now, the 3D graphics haven't held up all that great over time, but I still think this is a really sharp looking game, and most importantly, the gameplay of it is so good. It's like, this is an absolute no-brainer. I'm sure we'll get both games on there, but if I had to choose between Ocarina of Time or Majora's Mask first, I'm going Ocarina of Time first all the time. While we might not get a F-Zero game anytime soon, or ever again, to be honest with you, FZero X on the N64 is definitely a great game for the N64, and one that would just make its home on the Nintendo Switch. Now, the cool thing about FZero X is the fact that there's a lot of Switch games that don't run at 30 frames per second. There's a lot that do, and there's a couple that run at 60 frames, whereas FZero X was running at 60 frames per second on the N64. It is a high-octane racing game. It might not be the best looking game as far as the tracks are concerned, but the tracks themselves are fun. There's just some low polygon textures, but like, who cares? You're whizzing around these tracks at like the speed of light anyways. You're not looking at the tracks, you're looking at other racers to make sure you don't knock into them and they try to knock you off the course, and you're trying to get your boosts and whatnot. I know I'm kind of rambling with this game, but I feel like F-Zero is just a perfect fit. Maybe it's not a perfect fit for the modern era because we have sort of gone away from the arcade racing style of games, but I would still love to see a new F-Zero, and damn it, if I can't get a new F-Zero, FZero X on the N64 would definitely pick up the slack for me. Fighting games and RPGs were definitely underutilized on the Nintendo 64, and I'm not going to add an RPG into this list. I mean, Ogre Battle 64 was pretty good, but as far as a traditional RPG is concerned, we have Quest 64 and Brian. Like, his name is Brian. That's not very fantasy based here, and it's supposed to be a fantasy game. But on the fighting game side of things, we did have a couple games that really stood out, and Killer Instinct Gold is definitely a game that I feel stood out. Now, it's kind of weird. Some people dogged this game when it first came out, primarily because of the fact that 3D games were starting to become really popular and 3D fighters were catching on. Games like Tekken 2 and Virtua Fighter 2, and then you have Killer Instinct Gold, which is a 2.5D fighter basically taking place on a 2D plane with 3D environments. And yes, the characters are 2D sprites, so it kind of looks a little weird sometimes when you're talking about them with the 3D environments, but still, I think the gameplay of this game is what makes this game stand out. Of course, all the crazy combos, all the cool levels that you encounter, you could knock people off of the levels as well as sort of a finishing move in the game. Definitely an underrated fighting game, and a game that's pretty much been lost to the sands of time. And I feel like the N64 online service would be good for games like Killer Instinct on the Nintendo Switch as far as Killer Instinct Gold is concerned. Now, one genre of games that had a million entries in it was, of course, 3D platformers, and I went through the list of 3D platformers, and I ended up settling on just one for this video because, I mean, you could easily make a 3D platformer only list for the N64, but I'm going to go with BanjoKazooie just because I think the overall package of that game is great. Now, I love Super Mario 64. That is my favorite 3D platformer on the system, but if I had to pick a secondary one, it would be BanjoKazooie with probably Conker in third place. I love Conker, but that humor, you know, it's good. It's definitely good. It was great for the time, but it's just kind of, I don't know, a little bit lowbrow nowadays, whereas BanjoKazooie is more of a pure sort of 3D collectathon platformer game that N64 fans absolutely loved. Donkey Kong 64 was nowhere on this list because I don't like that game, but I do like BanjoKazooie, and I think this would be a fantastic entry for the Nintendo Switch's online service, and plus, I mean, he's in freaking Smash Brothers. Put Banjo on the N64 online service for the Switch. There's not many hidden gems on the N64, but one of the best hidden gems, which really isn't a hidden gem because every hidden gem person, probably myself included, has already talked about this game, would have to be Mischief Makers. Now, this game was designed by Treasure, and it sort of stands out on the N64 because it's a 2D action-adventure game. Yes, it has the 3D background sometimes, so it's sort of 2.5D, but really, it's a 2D platformer game where you're barreling through different enemies, solving different puzzles in some levels, and of course, really cool boss battles. I think this art style definitely holds holds up to today. It's one of the best looking N64 games when you're playing your N64 today because it's 2D. 3D, of course, hasn't aged all that well, whereas 2D has aged very, very gracefully. I think Mischief Makers is very fast-paced, very frantic, and most importantly, very fun, and would be a great game to add to the N64 when it comes to the Nintendo Switch Online service. And the final game is a wrestling game. Now, like I said, I couldn't do No Mercy, I couldn't do Revenge because of licensing issues. But there is one game that I feel like we could sort of circumvent these licensing issues, and that is Virtual Pro Wrestling 2. Now, Virtual Pro Wrestling 2 was essentially WWF WrestleMania 2000 for the Japanese market, but there's some slight differences in the game that make it actually a bit better, such as the spirit meter, and you could have like these, you know, Japanese style wrestling comebacks that are really cool. But most importantly, it still has that Aki engine, which is what we want from an N64 wrestling game. Now, yes, it does use real wrestlers from Japanese organizations and gaijins, which are, you know, white dudes and American dudes that are in Japanese wrestling federations, but I feel like get rid of the names, maybe change up the color palette of the characters, and like nobody will care. Nobody's looking for this like WWF would or WWE with their back catalog of games. This game absolutely kicks ass. It's probably the most imported N64 game of all time as well, and for good reason. It is a damn good wrestling game that is one of the reasons why the N64 is thought of in just such a high manner when it comes to wrestling games because of that Aki engine. Alrighty, so those are 10 N64 games that I want to see come to the Nintendo Switch's online service. I think this is an excellent list, but if you disagree, sound off in the comments section down below. Tell me what games you want to see, unless that game is Quest 64 starring Brian, like that's my stepdad's name, and like I would never imagine him going on like a magical quest with like water attacks and fire attacks. Brian. And as always, guys, thank you for checking out this video. If you are new to the channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button, be sure to like and share the video as well, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next one. Later.